Today we're going to be talking about Congress and the institution of Congress. Congress is basically one of the three main groups of our country that were formed when the country was first formed. It was created from the Constitution, or at least provided for by the Constitution, and it's basically been a mainstream throughout our government ever since. Um, so the way we get our members of Congress is we look at how many people actually exist in the country, and then we divide it amongst the country to say you get this amount of representatives, you get that many representatives, and so it's all basically proportioned by how many people actually live in a particular state or a particular district. So if you look at the House of Representatives, the House of Representatives is built up of people in districts. So those districts are all part of an actual state. So what will happen is, say the state gets 30 representatives based off of its total population. And the way we get this total population is every 10 years we have the census. So the census, which when it happens, it's really, really important just to figure out how well your state is actually going to be doing going forward for the next 10 years. And so, like I said, every 10 years it actually happens. And so what they'll do is they'll decide this many people moved here or moved away from there, so you gain or lost seats based off of the total percentage of it. Now, so the way the system works is, even though, like, say you had a state that had 5 people in it, you would still be guaranteed at least one House seat. And then based off of the main percentage, how many more seats you would get from there, which is why a state like Texas or California can actually get so many seats, whereas, you know, someplace like North Dakota or Kansas or some really small area gets hardly any of them. Now that's for the House. Now for the Senate, what they do is they go around they basically take the country and they divide it up amongst the states in the country. So there's 50 states, so there's 100 senators, because you get 2 senators per each state. And so that's literally, it's a statewide kind of position. Now originally, people didn't actually vote for the Senate. The Senate was actually a position that was actually given through all sorts of different ways. Quite often, your governor and your legislature would actually decide, you know, who actually gets to serve in your particular your state. And that changed to more of like the House system, which is the people actually vote for it, and that's kind of moved forward ever since then. So like I said, every 2000, 2010, 2020, whatever your census is, it can cause some states to become much more relevant than they were before, whereas some states basically relatively never change. So there are some states that hardly get any representatives at all. That's because they're huge farmland areas that have literally nobody actually living there, which kind of makes sense. So the size of the House is 435 members. Now that could change based off of whether or not the government decides to up or lower the numbers. There's an argument that not enough people are actually properly represented in the system, because back in, you know, the 1700s or 1770s, there were, you know, not a whole lot of people in the country. So that meant if there were several hundred actual representatives, they were representing fewer people, which meant people were actually better well represented. Now we're, you know, hitting the 300, 400 million people in the country. Basically, 435 members to actually represent them really means one person is representing way too many people. So some of the solutions they've actually suggested is adding more representatives. Well, part of the problem with that is if you add more representatives, that means those representatives in office right now have even less power than they had before. And members of Congress really don't want to do that. And literally, that's where the change has to take place. They're the ones that are going to kind of come up with the legislation to do it. And believe me, when you ask someone to give up power, they're not really willing to do that, especially people whose entire jobs are power. So part of the requirements of equal representation means, anybody should be able to be a senator or a Congress member. Historically, that's not worked out too well. We've gotten better, but again, it's one of those kind of situations that it takes time and it takes an evolution of our system to actually make sense or to make it work. One of the problems we ran into is something called gerrymandering. And gerrymandering is the idea of trying to basically divide up a particular state after the census in order to benefit one party over the other, which happens all the time. And so quite often the Supreme Court has to step in to say you can't do that. And every census, practically every census, you're going to end up with the same kind of situation happening over and over again. Now, the gerrymandering thing, in case you're ever wondering why it's actually called that, is a representative a long time ago when he was looking at this drawn out process for how they actually came up with a district, in order to get all people in one party basically not to have a vote and the other one to have pretty much all the votes. The person looked at it and said, that looks like a salamander, and gerrymander, you get the idea of how that kind of works. And so there are different kinds of, let's talk about Congress itself. Now, there's the idea of how representatives should actually serve. And we have basically 4 different processes or 4 different approaches to it. There's the trustee view. We have the instructed delegate view of representation, the partisan view of representation, and the Politico style. Now, the trustee is basically, if I'm put into office, I'm the one who basically makes the choices because I'm the best person to actually make it, or at least I think that is. The instructed delegate view is someone who actually comes into office and is kind of told what they have to do by the people. And then the partisan view of representation is somebody who basically, their only representation these days would be to support whatever political party they happen to be with. Part of the problem we kind of run into is we're very much in that latter part of how our representation exists today. Parties or people with partisan views are far more prevalent than they ever were before. The fourth way, which is called the Politico style, is basically you take all the 3 different kinds of approaches, trustee, instructed, delegate view of representation, and partisan view, and you kind of mesh them together and then try to come up with something that works to make, everybody kind of get along. And that's kind of how the process should have worked or has been working for years until highly partisan situations started happening. And we're now stuck with a very hard to get back to where we were before situation. It'll be interesting to kind of see how things go moving forward. So let's talk about how you become a member of Congress. So let's talk first about the House of Representatives. In order to be a member of the House of Representatives, you have to have been a citizen for at least 7 years prior to your election. You don't have to be born here, but you have to be a citizen. Now, if you look at like the president running for office, president has to be born in the United States, and there's all sorts of stipulations to that, like you can be born on a military post overseas, those kinds of things. But like I said, the House of Representatives, you just have to be born, but you have to be a citizen of the United States. You also have to be a legal resident of the state for which you're trying to actually be elected. You don't have to be a representative of the actual district that you're trying to run for, which has caused some problems in the past, but you literally just have to be of the state. And the other requirement is you have to be 25 years of age. Now, those are basically the three main requirements. And it's not a whole lot because it was never really designed to be restrictive. It's designed to be more reflective of the population in general. Now, the Senate, in order to become a member of the Senate, you have to be a citizen for at least 9 years. So rather than 7, it's now 9 years. Now, a legal resident of the state, again, they have to be a member of the state. So you can't literally be from Wyoming or living in Wyoming. You could be a legal resident anywhere because you can move somewhere and become a legal resident, but you can't be like a citizen of Wyoming and suddenly decide to move to run for Nebraska. It's just not how it's done. And so some people have actually changed their state residency just to run for the Senate. A good example is Hillary Clinton. She literally moved to New York to become a New York citizen so she could run to be a senator in New York. And so sometimes what will happen is a representative or a future representatives will look at where can I possibly win, and then move there and then become a citizen and then literally become a member of that area. So remember, she didn't have to actually, Hillary Clinton didn't actually have to be a citizen of New York for 9 years. She just had to be a citizen for 9 years. Well, being born in the United States kind of helps with that. And also the other requirement is, whereas the House of Representatives is 25, the Senate is 30. So if you think of it, it kind of goes on a gradual number of 5. So House of Representatives is 25 years, Senate is 30 years, and President is 35. So I guess they kind of thought, as you've served in time, maybe the next step up, well, you've got at least 5 years before you should get there, at least if you were somebody who started literally at 25 years old. So one of the concerns in government is what's called the power of incumbency, which means every election, somebody was probably in the office before. So if I was the senator from Texas, me being the senator from Texas means I'm called the incumbent. So what that has generally done for people is it provides a whole bunch of advantages. And those advantages are really not relatively obvious unless you actually kind of understand a little bit about the process. So one of the advantages for being a House of Representative incumbent is we have what's called the congressional franking privilege. One second. Now what that is, and it was much more relevant in the past than it is now, and there's a reason for it, and it has a lot to do with the internet. In the past, being a Congress member is you could send out mail free. And it's basically you just signed your name on the letter and it was sent out. And so that was a huge privilege because when it came to actually congressional information to your constituents, you could send out massive amount of information without paying a cent. And so that was huge, and it's still kind of around, and it's still a benefit, but it's not the benefit it used to be because people don't check their mail anymore. Like Some people don't even ever check their mail or even know that they had mail in the first place. And so because of that, it's become a lot less significant and important, because email is now becoming more of the contact of how things actually work with people. But one of the other advantages that incumbents have, what's called, is professional staff. And so you're already being paid a certain amount of money for your staff itself. I mean, you're not shelling that information out, shelling out that money yourself. You're getting that money from the government. There's a certain amount of money that they give you in order to run your particular office, or run your station, your office. And so you have those people at your disposal. Oh, one thing I did want to say about the franking privileges is, well, Congress members can send out anything free. You can't send out political advertisements for your actual campaign. And so what often they have to do is separate those two. So if it's something from their actual campaign, it's basically they have to pay for that. And so what they do to sometimes get over that, or to get around that, is they'll send out a lot of paraphernalia from their office, to constituents, to let them know kind of what's going on in their government, and what's going on with them. And so this is not a problem as long as they're not advertising for running for office. And so what will generally happen is, because just the power of getting their name out there, with the amount of times that they'll send stuff out there, is it benefits them when it actually comes to the main election, because people will recognize it. It's the whole name recognition kind of thing. That's actually another one of the advantages for incumbency, is name recognition. If you've had the position before, people tend to go, yeah, that person, yeah, he or she has been doing fine, I guess. I don't know anything about him or her, but nothing's wrong, so may as well just keep them in there. And so that happens a lot. And the other thing is, as a member of Congress, they have a lot of access to the media, so they can call up the media and get them to come out and actually interview them or talk to them, tell them about they can tell the media about a program that they actually want to get passed. And they get that attention that a candidate against them may not actually get, because a candidate running against them usually has to do something to cause the media to be interested in the first place. And so if you look at well, I'm not talking about the Congress, but like during the presidential election, a lot of the media attention that Trump got was just because he was basically doing things that were kind of way out of left field. And so that got a lot more attention than he ever would have received if he hadn't been doing something like that. So the same thing happens with Congress, is it works and helps them very much. Now, part of the power of incumbency is, if you are the incumbent, there's a very strong chance you can get reelected based off of just those factors alone. So let's talk about the elections themselves. So congressional terms are 2-year terms, unless something happens and they get removed from office, or they pass away, or they resign. We had a Congress member in Texas who resigned during the last term due to all sorts of irregularities. And then basically he had to be replaced. Now for the Senate, your terms are 6 years, which means the way they do that is they kind of offshoot, like you won't have them both running at the exact same time. So at least 2 years there may be a 2-year period where there's no election in your state for the Senate. But then the other 2 years, the other 2 times of 2 years, will actually have somebody running for the Senate. And it's just offset on kind of the way it works. Sometimes also based on when they first came in the first place. Congressional sessions, they're divided into 2 regular sessions. They can have special sessions. The president can call for some of those. and sometimes the Congress itself will call for it. Like very recently, the Senate Majority Leader decided to actually call a special session because to take care of some things that were actually going on in the country itself. There are no term limits for either the House or the Senate. There are constantly attempts to make it happen. But again, as I mentioned before, one of the problems of doing that, or one of the problems in trying to make that happen, is you're going to the people who have the power and asking them to take away their power. Not going to happen. So the only way to really get that happening is outside influences, because Congress is never going to do anything to cause themselves to lose power. So maybe if you had something kind of outrageous happen, it might actually cause it to be thought about, but it still would never come anywhere near to make it actually happen. So term limits are rarely ever going to come onto the scene, and it's just not going to happen. So let's talk about the leadership of Congress. So in the House, the leader of the Congress is called the Speaker of the House. He or she basically literally runs everything that's going on. Person's voted for by the rest of the House. You're literally going to only have somebody as the leader of the majority party, because they have to have a majority to win, is going to be the one to actually take that position. It's never happened to where a minority party is actually taking control as Speaker of the House. Which is why you have members of Congress always really working hard to make sure that you don't lose people to the other side, because there have been a few people during their administrations that just decided, or during their service, to say, I'm now part of the other party. And that can cause all sorts of problems, especially if the numbers are really, really close. Generally, they're not that close, so it never really runs into a huge problem, especially in the House. In the Senate, you might, because the Senate can sometimes be almost 50-50. And so then you literally have to rely on whoever's in charge to be the person literally in charge. So the Speaker of the House decides quite often who is going to be on what committee, and those committees are kind of broken up to actually get things done in Congress itself, because with so many people, you couldn't just have a whole bunch of people trying to get something done. You have committees where all sorts of different types of legislature takes place, and it works really, really well. So the House leadership has, like I said, a majority leader, and that person controls kind of, this is what's going on in Congress, in the House at least. There's a minority leader, which is the opposite party, and so the opposite party leader will then serve as kind of a huge emphasis on any challenges to the main leadership of the House itself. And the two of them, both the House majority leader and the minority leader, will decide the positions of people that actually serve on the different committees. And so based on the numbers of how many people you have, you get a certain percentage of how many people on each committee. And so quite often the numbers are chosen by the actual people on those leadership positions. There's one other position that does get mentioned from time to time that a lot of people don't understand what it is. But we have what's called the whips. And what they are, they're assistants to the majority and minority leaders. And they kind of serve as like the backup of the leadership. And so quite often, or at least historically, kind of like how the name kind of implies, their job was to get their party to do what needs to be done, to show up for votes, to vote for specific things, to just be out there in the media making the noise that they actually need to make. And so they're kind of like the rah-rahs of a particular party. So the other house, which is the Senate, has basically the same kind of thing of a majority and a minority leader, but there is a little bit of a difference. Constitutionally, the Senate is actually led by basically the Vice President of the United States, and so, which is significant. So if it came to a vote that was like 50-50, the Vice President of the United States would actually make the difference. But for the majority of the time that the Senate is actually in operation, it's whoever is called the President pro tempore, which is a title given to whoever the majority leader of the Senate happens to be. And this person will literally run the entire process for what's going on in the Senate. Like I said, the Vice President is supposed to be the person in charge of the Senate, but it's more of a figurehead kind of a position unless he or she has to actually vote at that very last vote. And so the party leaders, again, you have the Senate majority leader, Senate minority leader from the other party. And then again, it has the exact same structure of whips, whose entire job is to actually, get the party together and decide, yeah, we should do this, we shouldn't do that. And you people need to be signed on because this is what we're trying to do. And so, and they have a lot of power as well. So one second. The way Congress actually gets something done, and this is both houses, is they have what's called a committee system. Because like I said, if they tried to do all this stuff, just in open court or in open chambers, they'd never get anything done. So the committees sit down and they decide what legislation they want to do, and they argue back and forth what kind of legislation should actually happen, and then they move it forward into the actual voting process, and it goes through a number of different little nuances before it finally gets to a final vote in whatever chamber of the House it is, and then at the very end, after it's been voted, it then goes to the other house. So if it started off in the Senate, it goes to the House. If it started off in the House, it goes to the Senate. And so there's a lot of legislation that doesn't get passed because one or the other houses won't step up and pick it up. And so that's part of the way the founding fathers designed the system, because they wanted to make sure that there weren't, things being railroaded through the system. And that has happened in the past where things have gotten through, especially anything that's really politically hot potato like. It can really run through pretty fast, sometimes without actually thinking it through. There's been statements made where our leaders of Congress have actually said, we'll know what something is after it gets put into enactment, because we don't have time to read it now, which is really kind of dangerous. Because remember, a lot of the legislation, a lot of them haven't actually fully read. They just don't have the time. And some of those things are, 600 pages long. Your assistants might actually be the ones to actually read it. And so you're just kind of getting, bullet points on lots and lots of legislation in it. So that's kind of how our system actually works. So there's a whole bunch of different standing committees. They've been around for pretty much the beginning: agriculture, defense. All these different processes in order to get things done. So if I'm put onto the defense budget committee, my entire job in that particular committee is to decide, how much money should we be giving to that particular, industry or area of government. Now, I may not be a member of any other committee, but I could be a member of multiple ones. And there are people who are part of multiple different committees. And so where they are in these committees can put that person to a lot of power, and that's why I was mentioned before, your majority and minority leaders will put somebody onto a committee, basically sometimes to even reward them with power, because there's a lot of power that comes from a lot of these specific committees. Some of them are not really seen as, forward moving in careers, such as like the VA, which should be, but again, it's all kind of a political thing on kind of how the process actually works. So the other process to understand about Congress, and this is the more complicated one, is basically, and you hear this all the time, you can go back to the whole schoolhouse rocks sort of thing, how a bill becomes a law. And so there's a lot of processes through it and so many things built into the system in order to knock something out of becoming a law. Because originally the founding fathers didn't want a lot of change in government. They wanted slow incremental change. And when that exists as your foundation, it becomes really, really hard to get something done if something really needs to be done. So if you have a national emergency, sometimes it's difficult to get things done even if it needs to be done. And so there are so many other processes to it, like they'll add riders to it, to a piece of legislation, add stipulations that sometimes will serve in order to cause people to not want to vote for something, or cause even more people to vote for something. So if you're on a committee and you want to get something done, and a friend of yours on another committee wants certain things, added to the bill, they'll work with you and you get all sorts of really weird riders added to it, to where somebody originally said, let's balance the budget, or let's give a certain amount of money to this particular program. That by the time they're done could be so much different legislation than what the whole thing was designed to actually do. It is our process. It is the way we do things, and sometimes it creates all sorts of obstacles to actually getting anything done. So one of the other, but that's just getting something to become a law. And if it doesn't make it through the whole process, basically it just gets shelved and it never existed as anything other than an idea. There are all sorts of ways of trying to get things done through government, but at the very end of it, after you get something passed through Congress, and that's both houses of Congress, it still has to be signed by the president. And if the president decides not to like it, or decides that he or she doesn't like it, vetoes it, and there's all sorts of different vetoes, but we'll talk about that when we get to presidents. But if it's vetoed, basically it takes a 2/3 majority in order of both houses in order to get something passed, which makes it really difficult to pass something once a president has decided he or she doesn't want to have anything to do with it. But one of the other functions of Congress, and we're seeing a lot less of that these days than we used to, but it used to be a main function of it, because aside from getting money for districts, one of the things Congress used to do was serve as the investigation and oversight function of government, which means anything that was wrong with government, or anything that was perceived as could be better, it was Congress's job in order to do an investigation. So if you find something like, loot boxes in computer games, Congress will put together a group of people who actually investigated it, and they hold hearings and bring the executives in to actually talk about it. Now, that's not even a government function that they're talking about, but it's done because it's their job in order to see if there's something wrong pretty much in the government or the system itself. Now, for government itself, what'll happen is if there's something perceived to be wrong, like or a president doing something incorrect, or part of the executive department doing something incorrect, or sometimes you'll have like the judicial system doing something wrong. What they'll do is they'll do an investigation, a full investigation on that. They'll have hearings and everything. And then that leads in order to actually get some kind of resolution. For presidents and for justices themselves, we do have the process of called impeachment. There's been 3 impeachments done in our government. First one being Andrew Johnson, and the second one being Bill Clinton. Both of them were actually overturned, or basically didn't actually lead to a conviction. And then a third one, which is Donald Trump, and it 3 didn't lead to a conviction either. So of all the impeachments we've actually had of presidents, none of them actually gone through beyond the impeachment process itself. There was an attempt to make an impeachment of President Nixon, but he resigned before that actually happened. So some people actually think he was impeached, but he was not actually impeached. The process to make it happen was occurring, and that's probably why he resigned as quickly as he did, but it never actually happened. There have been other officials actually impeached before. Judge Thomas Porteous, I think that's actually how you say his name, in 2010 was actually impeached as well. So again, it's not just the president, it's also other branches of service. Now, if Congress investigated itself, because they generally would not impeach Congress members, basically they admonish people in Congress. Hasn't been too many situations of that nature, but there's a lot of admonishments. So basically it's, you did bad. That's about all they say. And you shouldn't do it again. So again, one of the other oversights that they have as part of the system for Congress is, which is called the confirmation process. So when somebody's actually being appointed to an office by the president, they have to be confirmed by the Senate. And some presidents have a real difficulty getting anybody confirmed, because sometimes the process is extremely political. So what they'll do is they'll appoint somebody for a certain amount of time, and then literally have to pull that person out of office because they never got the person confirmed. And so it has happened in the past, and it's probably going to happen quite often in the future. So one of the other processes that Congress actually works on is called budgeting. So they're supposed to come up with a budget pretty much every year, and quite often they don't. And it's because they can't agree on where funding comes. So what they'll do instead is they'll decide we're going to continue funding government for a certain amount of time, and hopefully we'll kind of come up with a solution. This has led to a bunch of government stops or government shutdowns, and it's not a good thing, and it's rarely something you can get around because politics will be politics. But basically they have until October 1st in order to actually come up with a budget and to pass it. And if they don't, then they have to do it by what's called continuing resolutions. So that's literally what Congress is. Kind of a gist and a rundown of it. So understand that our government is made up of 3 major branches. And so Congress serves as one of those branches. It's not more important than the other 2 branches, and it's not less important than the other 2 branches. What will happen over time is, depending on how powerful your president or your Supreme Court is, Congress may be much more powerful than it's ever been, or it may be almost a shadow of its former self. But that is our congressional process.